We are continuing in Galatians this morning. We're in Galatians chapter 2. And we're taking a side trip through Galatians as we study Acts. So we're looking at the New Testament church and how Christ worked in the New Testament church. And we saw Paul and Barnabas go through the cities of Pisidia, Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe, preaching the gospel and ministering to the people there. And as Paul went through these cities, there was the tension that arose, actually after he left, that certain Judaizers came into these cities and were preaching a different gospel. They were telling people that there was another gospel, and that the essence of this second gospel that the Judaizers were preaching was that you had to obey the Jewish laws first before you became a Christian. And then, once you were obeying the Jewish laws, then you could become a Christian. And Paul is arguing against this. He is arguing against this second gospel, saying that there is only one true gospel. There are not two gospels. There's only one. And Paul is very angry as he writes this letter. And now, at the time he writes the letter of Galatians, he is back in Antioch, where he and Barnabas returned after their first missionary journey back to Antioch, where it says he stayed a long time there in Antioch, ministering there at the church at Antioch. And it's believed that from that time in Antioch, Paul wrote this letter to the Galatians. Now, Antioch was a large, thriving city. Antioch was the third largest city in the Roman Empire at the time. Behind Rome itself was first. Alexander was the second largest. Then Antioch was the third largest city in the Roman Empire. And it had a thriving church. But this church was distinct from the church in Jerusalem. The members were distinct. The people were distinct. In that the church in Antioch was filled with Gentile Christians. Whereas the church in Jerusalem were Christians who came from Judaism. And maintained the Jewish laws and the Jewish rituals, whereas the church in Antioch didn't do any of that. They didn't maintain any of those Jewish traditions and rituals and so on. It was a completely Gentile church. And so Paul was living in this Gentile environment. He was ministering there. The church was thriving. And we're going to pick up here in Galatians chapter 2, before Paul had visited. Paul tells in chapter 1 that early on his ministry, when he was a new Christian, he had visited Jerusalem. He had visited Jerusalem and learned that the gospel that he was preaching, which he got from a revelation from Jesus Christ when he had his wilderness experience, was the same as the gospel that was preached by the church in Jerusalem. It was the same gospel. So now here we pick up in chapter 2, where Paul says, 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem, so that's 14 years later. So after his first trip, after he's been on his missionary journeys, now he's saying that I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and I took Titus with me also. So here Paul is going again to visit Jerusalem. He has Barnabas is with him. Now it's interesting that he has Barnabas with him, but he took Titus. Now Titus is a Greek. We're going to see in the next verse that Titus is a Greek Christian. And so Titus would not be comfortable in Jerusalem filled with Jewish Christians. Titus would have been kind of an outsider. He would have stuck out. He would have stood out being a Greek there. But Paul took Titus along in order to make a point, which we're going to see in a minute. Verse 2, and I went up by revelation. So Paul went to Jerusalem by revelation. Remember, in the city of Antioch, there were a number of prophets. The prophet Agabus had predicted the famine, and the other prophecies mentioned in the book of Acts from the prophets in Antioch. And it doesn't say that this is a prophecy, or if this is a revelation, was by the Spirit or by the intellect. It doesn't say. But Paul had a revelation, some new information that he wanted to talk to the leaders in Jerusalem. So Paul says, and I went up by revelation and communicated with them that gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation by any means, lest I should run or had run in vain. So Paul calls a private council with the leaders in Jerusalem over this very serious issue. The church was ready to split in half. The early church was ready to be torn in half by these different beliefs. And so Paul goes to meet with the leaders privately to work this out. Lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. And what this means, not that Paul was going to change his message, but Paul was afraid that the churches that he established would be lost. That work would be undone by these false preachers, as we're going to see, by these false teachers. Now Paul interrupts himself here with verse 3. He changes thoughts in verse 3. But neither Titus, who was with me being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. So Paul's interjecting this parenthetical thought that after he spoke with the leaders, he points out the fact that Titus, who was a Greek, wasn't compelled to be circumcised. But then look what happens, verse 4. And because of false brethren unaware brought in, who came privately to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us in bondage. So there were spies in Jerusalem. False brethren, he says, who sneaking around spied on them to see that Titus wasn't circumcised, and they were demanding that this Greek Christian be circumcised. That was the error. That was the error that Paul was fighting against. And so this is like a novel. This false brethren spying, sneaking around. And they wanted to bring, Paul says, they wanted to bring us into bondage. They wanted Titus to start keeping the Jewish rituals, all the Jewish laws, the dietary laws and all this, washing laws and all these things. And Paul calls that bondage. In verse 5 he continues, to whom we gave place by subjugation, no, not for an hour. Look how he says that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. So Paul says, no, we didn't give in to those false brethren for an hour. Today we would say, we didn't give in to them for a minute. I didn't think that for a minute. That's basically what Paul's saying here. We didn't give in to them for an hour. We stayed strong, we stayed firm in our convictions that Titus was a Greek who did not need to be circumcised in order to be a Christian. And he did this because of the truth of the gospel. Notice here that there was something in the balance. There was a balance between unity and truth. And Paul was weighing these things. Unity, truth, unity. And Paul came down on the side of truth. Paul valued the truth of the gospel more than the unity of the body. Truth is important. Truth is the important thing here. This is alive today. Even at the Church General Council we visited in June, there was a motion brought to the floor asking that these people with different theological ideas be accepted into the church. Now it was voted down, but it was a close vote, amazingly enough. And they were voting, they were weighing unity and truth. They wanted to compromise the truth for the sake of unity. Paul did not do that. He said truth is more important. So Paul, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. Now he picks up his original thought here in verse 6. But those who seemed to be somewhat, now he's talking about the leaders that he he conferenced with, but those who seemed to be somewhat, whosoever they were, it makes no matter to me. God accepts no man's person. So Paul makes another parenthetical note about the authority of these men, saying that he acknowledges that they were apostles, but he wasn't awed by their position. He says they're just ordinary guys like you and I. We're ordinary Christians. Because in God's sight, God is no respecter of persons. So, but he doesn't disrespect them in any way. He just acknowledges that he wasn't overawed by them. And then he continues in verse 6, for they who seemed to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. So Paul again says, here on his second visit, 14 years later, same conclusion that they arrived at in the earlier visit, that there was no difference between the gospel Paul was preaching, the gospel that Paul received from revelation of Jesus Christ, and the gospel that was being preached in Jerusalem by the Christians. The difference was that there were some false brethren who wanted to add something to the gospel, which we're going to see more in a minute. So they all agreed that the gospel that Paul was preaching was the same as the gospel that's preached in Jerusalem. And continuing in verse 7, but contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. So what this means is Paul was preaching to the Gentiles, Peter was preaching to the Jews. Now as I listened to different sermons on this text, one of the pastors pointed out that Peter was supposed to be preaching to the Jews, and somehow the Pope forgot that. I think it was in John Calvin's commentary that John Calvin takes a roundabout shot at the Pope, that the Pope should be ministering to the Jews, which he didn't do. But Peter was called to preach to the Jews, and Paul to the Gentiles. Continuing in verse 8, for he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision was the same, was mighty in me towards the Gentiles. So it's the same Christ. The same Christ Paul's preaching in Peter is preaching the same Christ to the Jews that Paul is preaching to the Gentiles. Continuing in verse 9, and when James, Cephas, that's Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go into the heathen, and they unto the circumcised. So here he says the same thing again. He repeats the same thing. That they had the right hand of fellowship. And it continues in verse 10, only that they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I was also forward to do. So they asked Paul to remember the poor, and Paul wanted to do that. Now there's some question about where this visit fits into the book of Acts. Now, some think that this visit that we just discussed was the visit talked about in Acts chapter 15, where Paul and Barnabas go to Jerusalem to have this council on this very issue. Some think it was a different visit, and a visit that's not mentioned in the book of Acts, that Luke doesn't mention in Acts. But the timing of the thing is not that important. You can still gather the lessons even without knowing the timing. But what we come to now is another visit in verse 11. Starting in verse 11, when Peter was come to Antioch. So Paul and Barnabas have now returned to Antioch. And now Peter travels from Jerusalem to Antioch to fellowship with the Antioch believers. And apparently, Peter spends some time in Antioch, fellowship with the believers, enjoying the believers' company, delighting in their free worship, and something goes wrong. it's explained here in verse 11. But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. Verse 12. For before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles, but when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. So here we have Peter enjoying the fellowship of the Gentile Christians, eating with them, which was against the Jewish regulations. And when certain other Christians from Jerusalem showed up, suddenly Peter changed his behavior. Peter stopped eating with his friends. Can you imagine how that would make you feel if that would happen to you? If you would suddenly be shunned or put off or getting a cold shoulder by a dear friend. But this is what happened. This is actually what happened with the Apostle Peter when these other Christians from Jerusalem came to Antioch to visit. Peter changed his behavior towards the Gentile Christians. It says he withdrew and separated himself, and it gives a reason why he did this. In verse 12, it's because he feared those of the circumcision. So this gives you an idea of the depth, of the intensity of the disagreement, of the power or the lure that this law-keeping had over those who were Jewish. It was part of their life. It was inbred in them. It was part of their character to keep these laws, and it was a very, very strong pull. We can hardly understand how strong that pull was, but it was so strong that even Peter, and we'll see not only Peter, but Barnabas and the other Jews were drawn away from what they knew to be true. And it was because of fear. Peter feared the Jews from James, the Jews from Jerusalem. Now this fear, the fear of man, Proverbs 29:25 says, fear of man is a snare. Fearing man will snare you into doing the wrong thing. You've heard this phrase, that such and such a person is a God-fearing person. Well, what that means when they say it's a God-fearing person is that means that person fears God above all else. That they don't fear man, and they don't fear circumstances. They don't fear the future. They don't fear the unknown. They fear God. You see, our lives are wrapped around with fear. There's fear. There's things to fear on every side. We don't give in to that fear as Christians. We don't want to give in to the fear, into these various fears. We want to fear God alone. And by saying fear God alone, that means trust God. God is a loving God. We can trust Him. And that's what it means to be God-fearing. And Jesus says the same thing in Matthew 10:28. Fear God. Don't fear man who can destroy the body, but fear God who can destroy both body and soul. Fearing God is a very liberating thing. It's a very freeing experience when you begin to fear God and stop fearing man. And stop fearing these circumstances and the culture push that comes into our life. But fear God. That gives us the power to stand up against the culture and bad ideas. But Peter didn't do that. Continuing in verse 13, and the other Jews disassembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas was carried away with their dissimulation. You see, this fear spreads. one person, if a leader has fear, this spreads to the rest of the body. And so because Peter was fearing, then Barnabas of all people, Barnabas, Paul's best friend, started fearing, and the other Jewish Christians started to fear. But the thing was getting out of hand. And Paul addresses this, verse 14, but when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth, here we are back to the truth again, not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, if thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of the Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? So what Paul is saying here, Paul asks Peter, why are you pushing this Jewish laws on these Gentiles, knowing that not even the Jews can keep the law? You see, there's a great irony in this situation, in that Peter had trusted Christ for his salvation. Remember in Acts chapter 10, when Peter was on the roof and the tarp was lit down 3 times. God said, take and eat it. And Peter said, no, Lord, I never. And God said, do not call unclean, which I have called clean. So Peter knew this. And Peter had already realized that he was saved by grace and not by works. And now here the irony of the situation is that Peter, as he was turning to the Gentiles, as he was turning away from grace, he was turning to the Gentiles. He was breaking the law of grace by which he was saved. He knew that the law could not save because man couldn't keep the law, and he was turning back to that law, already committing a sin, basically. Knowing that the law can't save you from sin, but only grace, that Peter was committing a sin and turning back to the law. And Paul rebukes him for this. Paul rebukes him publicly for this in front of everybody. Paul rebukes Peter for this. Because Peter had sinned publicly, so Paul rebuked him publicly for this. Now, to Peter's great credit, Peter accepted this rebuke. And at the end of Peter's life, Peter writes in 2 Peter, I'm looking at 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. And account that the long suffering of our Lord is salvation, even as our beloved brother Paul also, according to the wisdom given unto him, has written unto you. So Peter was able to call Paul a beloved brother. In all his epistles, verse 14, speaking in them of things in which are some things hard to be understood. So Peter, not only does he call Paul a beloved brother, but he calls the epistles of Paul, he puts them on the same level as Scripture. And remember, Paul, in Romans chapter 7, Paul says himself, he writes, that I do the very things I hate. Who will deliver me from this body of death? So Paul understood this weakness. Paul himself was not immune to it. He felt this in himself. But they were able to come together then at the end. Now Paul continues here at verse 15. We who are Jews by nature and not sinner of the Gentiles. So Paul is addressing the Jews here with this we. Continuing in verse 16. Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ that we might be justified by the faith of Christ and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. You see, the Jewish Christians sometimes struggled to understand the purpose of the law, why the law was given. God revealed himself to Abraham. He revealed himself to Isaac and to Jacob, and eventually to Moses, and to the millions of Jews who left captivity in Egypt. And all along, God is revealing himself. He's revealing more about his character. And in the desert, God gives the law to Moses. And the purpose of this law, the purpose of this revealing, is to show the need for Christ. The purpose of the law, Paul says later in Galatians, was given as our tutor to lead us to Christ, to teach us that we couldn't keep the law. But you see, what happened to the Jews over time is they took the law that God gave and they added to the law these other regulations, these other laws, these interpretations of the law. And the effect of that is that it removed the teeth, it defanged the law, it softened the law. The effect of these other regulations that they had around the law softened the law so that it was easier to keep, it was easier to maintain. For instance, the law about adultery. They interpreted this in such a way that they said you can only commit adultery if it's with another Jewish man's wife. Having sex with a slave is not adultery. Having sex with an unmarried woman is not adultery or anybody else besides another Jewish man's wife. So they put such a narrow interpretation on the law that it was easy for them to maintain, to keep this law. And what happened is they began to be self-righteous about the law. They thought that they were keeping the law, they were being self-righteous, and that they didn't need Christ. Christ comes along and reinterprets the law, strips away all of those other regulations that they had on it, and reinterprets the law when Christ said in the Sermon on the Mount that if you lust after a woman, it's the same as committing adultery. So he put the law to a higher level. No wonder the Jews hated him for it. But the point is that the Jews missed the point of the law, which was to lead us to Christ. They were satisfied in the law. They liked the law. They loved the law. They felt happy in the law. It gave them a sense of satisfaction to know that they could keep the law, and they didn't see any reason to change. That's the problem. They were just self-satisfied with their reinterpretations of the law. So now enter the Christian picture, and they want to go back into these old habits, these old patterns again, and bring the law into Christ. Paul continues in verse 17, but if we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners. Is therefore Christ the minister of sin? God forbid. So this verse 17 is a little complicated. And he's anticipating the objections of the Judaizers, saying that there's no way that you can be saved by faith alone. It's too easy. It's too easy to be saved by faith alone. Where's the stringency in this? We will sin, and Christ will be a minister of sin. And Paul says, not so. It's not so. It's the wrong way to think about it. It is easy. Grace is free. It's easy, but we're constrained by love to obey Christ, not by the law. Paul continues in verse 18, and now notice he switched from we earlier to the pronoun I. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. So Paul has already given up on the law. And now is he going to take the law again? That means he would be a sinner if he did that. Verse 19, for I through the law am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. So the law taught him, verse 19, that he was dead to the law and alive to Christ. And he says the same thing, he rewords it in verse 20. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So Paul says, I am crucified with Christ. That means Christ was crucified on my behalf. That's what he means. When I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. And then he continues, but it's not me who's living, it's Christ who's living in me. So Christ was crucified on my behalf, and he lives on my behalf. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved himself and gave himself for me. Hallelujah. And the chapter closes with verse 21. I do not frustrate the grace of God. For if righteousness come by the law, then Christ died in vain. Righteousness doesn't come from the law. Righteousness comes from Christ. Hallelujah.